Good evening, it's Sunday the 25th of July 2010. I'm Chris Jury and you're listening to Agitpop, the pop and politics show on North Cotswold Community Radio. At this time on a Sunday for the last 6 weeks we have been speaking about music and politics to guests such as actor Dudley Sutton, philosophers Brad Hooker and Angie Hobbs, novelist Henry Porter and Cotswold District Councillor Lyndon Stowe. Tonight, the last episode in the current series, is an interview I recorded a few weeks ago in Blockley with Alan Rusbridger, editor of The Guardian newspaper since 1995. The track you're listening to now is from Joe Jackson's cracking 1978 album Look Sharp and is, of course, Sunday Papers.
Mother doesn't go out anymore, just sits at home and rolls her spastic eyes. But every weekend through the door come words of wisdom from the world outside. If you want to know about a bishop and an actress, if you want to know how to be a star, if you want to know about the stains on the mattress, you can read it in the Sunday papers. Sunday papers. Mother's wheelchair stays out in the hall. Why should she go out when the TV's on? Whatever moves beyond these walls, she'll know the facts when Sunday comes along. If you want to know about the mad punk rockers, if you want to know how to play guitar, if you want to know about any other suckers, you can read it in the Sunday papers. Read it in the Sunday papers. Sunday papers. Don't ask no questions. Sunday papers. Don't get no lies. Sunday papers. Don't raise objections. Sunday papers. Ain't got no eyes. Brother's heading that way now, I guess. He just read something, made his face turn blue. Well, I got nothing against the press. They wouldn't print it if it wasn't true. If you want to know about the gay politician, if you want to know how to drive your car, if you want to know about the new sex position, you can read it in the Sunday papers. Read it in the Sunday papers. Sunday papers. Don't ask no questions. Sunday papers. Don't get no lies. Sunday papers. Don't raise objections. Sunday papers. Ain't got no eyes. Sunday papers. Don't ask no questions. Sunday papers. Don't get no lies. Sunday papers. Don't raise objections. Sunday papers. Ain't got no eyes. Read all about it. Sunday papers. 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 Read all about it. Sunday paper. Get your Sunday paper. Get your Sunday paper. Get your read all about it. Sunday paper. Get your Sunday paper. Get your Sunday paper. Get your read all about it. Sunday papers.
So Alan, there we are, Sunday Papers by Joe Jackson. It's quite a dismal view of the papers these days, and that was written in 1978, and You certainly couldn't argue that the papers have got any better. Well, certainly not at the tabloid end. So, how do you think the papers are doing today?
Well, that's such a big question. We could spend the next 2 hours discussing that, because there's the sort of editorial performance of what they're doing. There's the circulation figures. There's the whole technological challenge. There's the advertising challenge. It's never been a more challenging time. I think that's probably literally true. I think never has there been a more challenging time to be running a newspaper, because the threat from everyone else on the internet is so clear and present. I mean, I try to be optimistic about it, because I think if we can see our way through and harness this great thing that's happening digitally, we can transform journalism and produce something at the end of it that's going to be richer, more diverse, better than existed before. But if you ask any journalist at the moment in a newsroom and ask them their instant reaction about how newspapers are going, you'd get a lot of anxious replies.
There's a dual tradition in newspapers in the UK, with the broadsheets at one end and the tabloids at the other end. But there's an argument that the broadsheets are becoming more tabloid. They're moving towards the tabloids. Do you think that's a valid criticism?
For a start, I think there are three markets. There's the broadsheets, mid-markets and red tops. I think that's a sort of more accurate description of what's going on. I think there was undoubtedly a period in the late 90s when the Independent led the charge to become a tabloid. So we had 4 broadsheets, 5 broadsheets, if you include the FT at that time. And then suddenly everyone was a tabloid. And I think there was a danger then that of broadsheets adopting tabloid techniques. The most obvious thing there is that in order to attract attention on the newsstand, you have to find one big punchy story on the front page. And that's I think what tabloids at their best do. So I think there is a danger that you've described of that happening. But I think there are some papers, I would say The Guardian is one of them, the FT is another, that have stood out against that and have gone for complexity, which is what I think broadsheets are about, is trying to reflect the complexity of life, whereas tabloids generally try to simplify.
There's a great deal of dissatisfaction in the Anglo-American world. We're often described as the most depressed, the most unhealthy, the richest, but nonetheless deeply unhappy. Do you think the press has a significant role to play in creating that underlying dissatisfaction with life?
Well, I don't think any editor wakes up in the morning and worries about their readers' happiness. Maybe we should. I mean, what's the answer to that? I mean, I think that there is a danger that by highlighting things that are bad, and that tends to be how people define news. It's the the dog bite man argument. So generally what newspapers tend to write about is what happens when things go wrong. So you multiply that day after day, week after week, and I think newspapers can be fairly accused of accentuating the bad, the alarming, highlighting fear. I mean, there are a number of studies in the field of crime where if you compare people's fear of crime with the actual position on crime, people's fear of crime is not matched by the reality. And you can probably blame some newspapers for helping to create that atmosphere. So I think there's something in that.
I don't know you very well, Alan, but you don't strike me as a cynical man. But the stereotype of the cynical, hardened newspaper man is a well-established cliché. And perhaps it's that underlying cynicism that I'm trying to get at. The idea that people are rotten to the core, that politicians are all greedy and corrupt, that there couldn't be a good or an altruistic motive for public service. Perhaps that cynicism is what creates this underlying dissatisfaction, especially within the political, civic and public domain.
Well, I've got some sympathy with that. I mean, there are a number of sayings about journalism that people trot out, which I don't really agree with. There's one about the proper relationship between a journalist and a politician is that between a dog and a lamppost, is a well-known saying. Another well-known saying is, I can't remember if this was attributed to Paxman or someone else, but it's, whenever I look at a politician, I think, why is this lying bastard lying to me? Another is that news is everything that somebody somewhere doesn't want you to read. So there are these sort of definitions of news that I think are quite cynical. And I think I've probably come at the world from a different place. It's not my automatic assumption that people are lying or that politicians are venal and greedy. And so it's a different starting point. Now, quite often politicians do turn out to be liars and venal and greedy. And every time that happens, the sort of cynical school of journalists say, well, there you are, that's what I told you. But I've never wanted to myself edit a paper that started from that starting point.
So what led you into journalism in the first place then? You went to Cambridge. What did you study at Cambridge?
I studied English at Cambridge, which was, I think, probably had nothing to do with journalism at all, except that the way English was taught at Cambridge, you did have these impossible tasks where you'd do Dickens in a week, and the next week it would be the Romantic poets in a week, and then it would be George Eliot in a week. And I think a lot of students get quite good at realizing they're never going to be able to read all these books, and so they become very good at aggregating and essentially nicking other people's views and turning out something that seems plausibly your own. So you could say that's a training in journalism. So while I was there, I started writing pieces for the Cambridge Evening News. They paid £5 a time, I think, for a little column of sort of musings about nothing, and I started writing those, and I found I had some skill at that. And then I went in my last year and went and had an interview there, and a week after I left Cambridge, I was living in a completely different Cambridge, which was the town, not the gown, doing flower shows and court reports.
And what had led you to journalism, to use your skills? What was it attracted you about journalism?
Well, I think completely accidental. I mean, my father was an avid newspaper reader, so I lived in a house in which it was the norm for parents to be sitting behind a paper for hours on hours a day. So I think I was interested in newspapers and news, but I didn't have a sort of driving sense that was going to be my destiny. I did a couple of holiday jobs, what would now be called internships, but at that time I was just trying to think of something interesting to do in the holiday. And I knew the moment I pitched up in a newsroom, I knew I loved it. This incredible randomness, you had no idea what you were going to do when you went in the day, and this sort of license to be as nosy as you wanted about anything, and you got to know a town very, very well. So I grew up in a town called Guildford in Surrey, and it was only when I went to work on the Surrey Advertiser for the holidays that it was a sort of crash course in this town that I thought I didn't know, and I was suddenly finding all kinds of streets and sporting activities and clubs that were there, but I'd never known about.
So you weren't driven to journalism by any campaigning zeal?
When I was doing these holiday jobs, that was the early 70s, so it was before Watergate, and it was the local newspaper experience, which was not about campaigning. It was about quite mundane things, like covering the leisure and amenities committee of the local council and getting the names right in courts and doing flower shows and
our own beloved Cotswold Journal.
Quite, and that was the bread and butter of what you did. You didn't think you were there to expose the mayor or to bring down the sports centre administrator.
Did you have strongly held political views then?
I didn't. I was at Cambridge in the early 70s, 73 to 76, which was kind of the generation after the 60s and that very political generation. I think it was all calming down a bit. And it didn't really chime with anything in my experience. I think I was more interested in music than politics. It was journalism, really, that exposed me to a world that I'd been relatively sheltered from, that I think was my political education. And so it was then that I started asking questions about what I saw around me.
So you spoke of music there, and we'll move on to your first choice in a moment. So what were you listening to then?
I had spent quite a narrow life, I now see, musically. As a young boy, I'd sung in a cathedral choir. I knew the 19th century canon of church music very well.
As opposed to the Bay City Rollers.
Right. I'd then won a music exhibition to school, and I'd sung in choirs, played in orchestras, chamber music, piano, clarinet. I really wanted to be in the National Youth Orchestra. I wasn't good enough. And towards the end of my school days, there was the sort of late days of the Beatles, and I really loved the Beatles. And when I got to Cambridge, I then had my musical education expanded in all senses, including by people who, forced me to listen to the Stones and the Grateful Dead and people like that.
Well, you're 3 years older than me, which means you must have been a prog rock boy. Yes? Genesis, all that?
No, I mean, I think my musical tastes and education are still very narrow, and I've now got daughters who are. I've got one daughter in particular who has an encyclopedic knowledge of all music since Elvis, and she thinks I'm pathetically narrow, and that I try to interest her in Schubert, and she tries to interest me in the stuff that she's listening to, and
You can't remember the name.
which I can't remember the name of, and it now may be too late, and I think I don't think we
Whatever
sort of.
gets you through the night.
Yeah, it's a regret, because I think it was snobbishness, really. Well, I don't know if it was snobbishness, but I was slow to recognise the power and interest of that music.
Which leads us to your first choice, actually, which is one of those classical pieces that you would have been educated in as a teenager, I imagine, and that is a piece of Beethoven. Do you want to just tell us a bit about
Well, it's the Eroica Symphony. I've become very interested in Beethoven during the years, because I recently sat down and wrote a play about him, because he is the most amazing man, the music is the most amazing music, and trying to get to grips with what it was that drove him and his music. And I think one of the stories in Beethoven, which was a sort of match that story that the early 19th century, was the individual and society, that whole changing relationship between the individual, which you can hear in a lot of the chamber music. You think of the fourth piano concerto, the slow movement of that, which is this sort of literally the individual piano against the orchestra of society. And Beethoven,
about the Enlightenment here, really?
yeah, it was the beginning of that, and it's the first time I think in music you can begin to hear this articulation of these what were essentially ideas of how society should be organised. And in the middle of that comes along Napoleon Bonaparte, and Beethoven thinks he is a great man and writes something called the Bonaparte Symphony, and then he becomes completely disenchanted with him. He thinks, I had thought he was a different kind of man, but he's just going to be another dictator. And so he scrawls out Bonaparte at the top of the symphony, and it becomes the Heroic Symphony, the Eroica.
And here it is, the start, the first movement of the Eroica by Beethoven. So there we are, the Eroica Symphony by Beethoven. So what was it about that in terms of a show like Agitpop, where we're talking about the political ideas behind it? We've discussed some of that about the Enlightenment. So when did you first come across it, and what was it that excited you about it?
Well, it was the power of the music. I mean, I think all those Beethoven symphonies are revolutionary pieces. The immense force of what you could do with that sound, and also new forms and structures. But it was really, I mean, I suppose it's a very interesting idea to be, forced to sit down and sit and think about the relationship between music and politics. And your brief was to think about people who tried to change the world. And I think that's what Beethoven wanted to do. So, some of my choices there are quite lateral. You look at them and you don't immediately see what politics has got to do with it. But the more you look at Beethoven, there was an individual absolutely trying to change the world and intensely plugged into the amazing turmoil of European politics at the time. And it is there in the music if you want to look for it.
And he chose culture to try and change the world, not politics.
Yeah, well, culture chose him, but that was his medium. I think he's an extraordinary composer. I mean, my play was about this extraordinary relationship he had with his nephew, which I think nowadays would be regarded as an abusive relationship. But I think what you hear in Beethoven's music are all these unresolved tensions, these lights, these shades of anger, the happiness, which he couldn't resolve except through music. And I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in is how nowadays, through psychotherapy and drugs, and you would be treated for that nowadays, and whether that doesn't now even out these elemental forces which art in the 19th century, there was no treatment like that, so it came out in the art.
The whole idea that genetic engineering of human beings, the danger of that, in my field, some of the greatest film directors and writers have been alcoholics, and that one can argue that part of their ability to see the world in a different way comes from their illness, and that if you get rid of all of that,
you lose the art.
You lose, not only do you lose the art, but you lose a perspective on the world that is not the same as everyone else's.
Yeah.
Which sort of leads me there to that thing you were talking about earlier, which is the core of liberal politics, certainly, which is the relationship between the individual and society and the boundaries of what it is to be an individual, which actually, as you say, is a modern idea in terms of history, really. I don't think pre the Enlightenment the concept of the individual was the same as it is today at all. And that, the Guardian is regarded as the liberal newspaper, certainly has historically. Is that type of political ideas, are they important to you now?
Very much, and that whole word liberal is something we constantly re-examine. What liberal economics was in 19th century Manchester when the Guardian was started was very different from how people would lazily think of liberal economics today. Some people who think Margaret Thatcher was the sort of high priestess of liberal economics.
It's interesting that you use liberal in the economic sense rather than the social sense.
Well, that's one way in which you stumble upon this word liberal pretty early, because it's got lots of different meanings in economic and in social sense, or if you're trying to set out to maintain the liberal traditions of a liberal newspaper, you have to keep asking yourself, well, what does that actually mean?
A modern American concept of liberal is laissez-faire capitalist meaning of liberal, which is based in a very harsh form of capitalism.
Yes, and equally, if you go to America and say, I'm a liberal, that's almost a dirty word, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, because the Guardian now has a very big readership in America, but if you describe yourself as a liberal newspaper, which I'm perfectly happy to do in the UK,
yes,
they look at you as though you're mad, and they say, please don't use the L word. That's a terrible word in America.
So how would you negotiate that in America?
Well, then you get into words that essentially mean the same thing, such as progressive.
Liberal in the UK would be regarded as relatively harmless, whereas progressive would be associated with a sort of more left-wing 70s, 60s.
Teachers.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? That the way these words mean different things on either side of it.
Yeah, well, it's one of the interesting things about politics, about society. The things are never fixed, are they?
Yeah.
So you think ideas suddenly become dominant, and then in a very short period of time you realise actually the pendulum has swung back.
So let's have a look at your next track now, which we have actually played on the show once before on the election night special, but it's well worth playing again. A fantastic piece of music, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday.
blood on the leaf and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rise, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop.
So there we are. Fantastic, moving, horrible song there. Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Very moving piece of music, I think. It's got an almost gothic feel to it. Obviously, the strange fruit referred to are black Afro-American bodies hanging from trees after lynchings. So when did you first hear that, and how did it impact on you?
I heard it about 10 years ago on a show a bit like this. I think the nice thing about shows like this is a complete serendipity. You're lulled into somebody else's taste, somebody else's selection. Suddenly you hear them talking about it. And I had never heard this piece before, and I was just absolutely rooted to the spot by it. I mean, it's partly the voice of Billie Holiday, which is amazing, but knowing what it was about, it was the most sort of shocking combination of music and lyrics and voice. And of course, you then read about this song and you realize actually it was one of the most powerful songs of the whole 20th century, if not the most powerful song.
And it was banned in numerous places. She was stopped from singing it in various venues. You know, her life is such a tragedy of discrimination and oppression, and it really, and you can hear it all in her voice when she's singing Strange Fruit, because she sang it from very early on, but the recording that we now hear them, and we've just heard now, was recorded when she was a bit older, and there's a fantastic YouTube thing of her singing it with the piano and just her face. And this is in the land of the free, all this was happening in the 20th century.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. Some people would say that those attitudes still persist in the South. So incredible that it's that recent.
I'm a great believer in art and culture as an expression of ideas, not just emotions, and the reason I think that is because they do both. You know, the statistics of lynchings and whatever is one part of the story, but a song like Strange Fruit, which combines the emotion with the reality of it, is immensely powerful.
Yes, and it speaks to the power of jazz itself. I mean, I think that song was actually written by two white, probably Jewish writers in New York.
They were, yeah.
But, you know, that's what happened.
They saw a photograph.
That's what happened in the 1920s, that this incredible black music, you know, the writers like Gershwin realized in the 1920s that this was unbelievably powerful music that had grown from grassroots up. So it was a kind of opposite of Beethoven, which was a very art form,
educated class,
elite music with its own rules. Jazz is still only 20 or 30 years old. No rules, has grown from the grassroots up. And the power of that message, as you say, that it was actually, you know, a banned song. It was so threatening to the thing that it was about that people tried to suppress it.
And it's quite extraordinary that, you know, we were talking just a moment ago about the Enlightenment ideas, people like Tom Paine, who were crucial in defining the American ideas of the individual, and yet this terrible thing, slavery and the oppression of
It's a terrible story, and I still feel we don't know enough about it. It wasn't taught.
It is still a hidden history.
When I was, I was learning history at school, We've learned a bit about William Wilberforce, but the enormity of what was going on just wasn't taught. So I think it's still something the West has yet to fully come to terms with and atone for.
So now we'll move on to your next piece, which is a piece by Benjamin Britten, I believe, and it's from Peter Grimes, and it's the Sea Interlude, and it's The Storm, yeah?
Yeah, there are 4 sea interludes, and this is the one called The Storm.
Okay, here it is. The Storm, Benjamin Britten. So Benjamin Britten, one of the greatest British composers, and Peter Grimes as a political piece. Interesting idea.
Well, I went to see the first performance of Peter Grimes in Aldborough, which was done about 3 or 4 years ago. And I didn't know the full opera, and the 4 sea interludes, it's an orchestral suite from the opera. And I just thought this was the most extraordinary opera. So it's and to see it in Suffolk, because it's from a poem by George Crabbe about this outsider in society. So we're back to this theme of the individual and society, and the relationship between this overbearing, domineering sea captain and boys, and the boys who work for him. And so on one level, it's about this story of Grimes and the exploitation of the boys who work for him. But of course you can't get away from Benjamin Britten, gay man in the 1940s when homosexuality was illegal, and what must have been the subconscious subtext of Britain feeling, again, a lone individual excluded from society, and the power of the mob or majority opinion to persecute minorities or people who don't quite fit. And seeing this opera in Aldborough, where Britain lived with Peter Pears, was just incredibly unsettling and powerful.
You used a word there that interests me actually quite a lot, the mob, and something that I hear quite a lot from liberals especially. And it seems to me that the concept of the mob and majority rule as being a dangerous thing sets up a number of contradictions in a democratic society. Because obviously, if we refer to the mob as a hysterical, out of control group of people rampaging through the streets, breaking windows, then I don't think I could disagree with you. But it seems to me that it's used more widely than that. And I think there's a danger in it that it's used usually by people in an elite to suggest that they know better than other people.
Well, I think it's one of those perpetual tensions in society that we've been talking about. So I think you're right that liberals think, the advances in enlightenment, to use it in the non-political sense, things like gay rights, the fact that we don't hang people anymore, that these are enlightened opinions that came about from a kind of enlightened paternalism, because it was mainly men at that time who would, and a fear that if you had a kind of plebiscite on those kind of things, on civil partnerships or on bringing back hanging, you've got no idea what would happen. You could easily slip back into.
But there's an idea there.
Against that, there is, as you say, generally in most things, you do want to trust people and not regard them as unthinking,
because
stupid.
There is an idea behind that idea that if we allow the majority to decide these things, they will be regressive, they will be dangerous, they will impose draconian measures on individuals who are on the edges of society. So that's an idea about what would happen, and that's not unchallenged. There are many people, and I would count myself amongst them, who don't think that's what would happen. And when that does happen, they're led by people who create those environments, like Hitler, like in Yugoslavia more recently, where in fact it was leaders who created the environment in which those things would happen.
Yeah, well, I suppose this brings us back to the role of the media as well, because I suppose the sort of John Stuart Mill in me thinks that in a sort of equal marketplace of ideas, you can trust people to make the right decisions, because they will be exposed to all the arguments, and the arguments will generally, you would hope, lead an enlightened direction. But if the public debate is dominated by people who, through wealth primarily, can afford to dominate the debate, then the arguments are not fairly ventilated or exposed. You kind of see that with Fox News in America these days. And so you don't get a people that is exposed enough to and educated enough in the arguments to make rational decisions.
Most surveys amongst the British people, for example, show that the British people don't really, generally speaking, care much about people's sexuality or...
Not now. One of the reasons I put down Peter Grimes was because I went to sit my first civil partnership last week, and I was thinking back to my days on the Cambridge Evening News in the 1970s, when at that point there were sit-ins of pubs by gay men and women, pubs who wouldn't serve gays. And I remember going along to cover that as a reporter, and it was a kind of seedy underworld. It just was. And to move from that to be able to go to a civil partnership in the space of one generation is incredible. It's an amazing advance.
My best friend at university was gay, and I remember having a quite disturbing conversation with my parents, because they said this is an illness, being gay is an illness and needs to be treated in a mental hospital. It was doubly ironic because my sister then turned out to be gay. But my parents had acquired those views. They didn't just appear. Those views had been disseminated to them. So as you say, this brings us onto the idea that a genuinely free press is absolutely crucial to avoid mob responses.
Yes, I completely agree with that, and would take it further. It used to be said that the freedom of the press is restricted to those who own them, i.e. if you were rich enough to afford a printing press, you then monopolise the debate. Well, I think it's extremely healthy now that the internet enables more or less anybody. Not if you're extremely poor living in Africa, but most people have access to the debate, and I think that is really a liberating thing. has dangers, but broadly a very good thing.
We'll move on now to your next piece of music here. We couldn't get more different, really. We're leaping now to 1957. Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story opens as a Broadway musical, and in it is the song Officer Krupke, and here it is.
See, them cops, they believe everything they read in the papers about us cruddy JDs. So that's what we give them, something to believe in.
Hey, you!
Who, me, Officer Krupke?
Yeah, you! Give me one good reason for not dragging you down to the station house, you punk!
Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing upkeep that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly Moses, naturally we're punks. Gee, Officer Krupke, we're very upset. We never had the love that every child ought to get. We ain't no delinquents, we're misunderstood. Deep down inside us there is good. There is good, there is good, there is good, there is untapped good. Like inside, the worst of us is good.
That's a touching good story!
Let me tell it to the world!
Just tell it to the judge!
Dear kindly judge your honor, my parents treat me rough with all their marijuana. They won't give me a puff. They didn't want to have me, but somehow I was had. Leap on lizards, that's why I'm so bad.
Right, Officer Krupke, you're real square. This boy don't need a judge, he needs an analyst's care. It's just his neurosis that ought to be coined. He's psychologically disturbed.
I'm disturbed.
We're disturbed, we're the most disturbed. Like we're psychologically disturbed.
Hey! In the opinion of this court, this child is depraved on account he ain't had a normal home.
Hey, I'm depraved on account I'm deprived.
So take him to a head shrinker. You!
Who, me?
My daddy beats my mommy clobbers me. My grandpa is a commie, my grandma pushes tea. My sister wears a mustache, my brother wears a dress. Goodness gracious, that's why I'm a mess.
Yes, Officer Krupke, he shouldn't be here. This boy don't need a couch, he needs a useful career. Society's played him a terrible trick. And sociologically, he's sick.
I am sick.
We are sick, we are sick, we are sick, sick, sick. Like we're sociologically sick.
In my opinion, this child does not need to have his head shrunk at all. Juvenile delinquency is purely a social disease.
Hey, I got a social disease.
So take him to a social worker.
Which way?
Dear kindly social worker, they tell me get a job, like be a soda jerker, which means like be a slob. It's not I'm antisocial, I'm only anti-work. Glory, Ivy, that's why I'm a jerk.
Officer Krupke, you've done it again! This boy don't need a job, he needs a year in the pen! It ain't just a question of misunderstood. Deep down inside him, he's no good!
I'm no good!
We're no good, we're no good, we're no good. We look like the best of us is no damn good.
The trouble is he's lazy.
The trouble is he drinks!
The trouble is he's crazy.
The trouble is he stinks!
The trouble is he's growing.
The trouble is he's grown.
Krupke, we've got troubles of our own. Officer Krupke, we're down on our knees.
Cause no one wants a fella with a social disease.
Officer Krupke, what are we to do? Please, Officer Krupke, Krup you!
So there we are, Officer Krupke. Not perceived by many, I'm sure, as a hugely political song. So what led you to that?
Well, there's Leonard Bernstein essentially taking Romeo and Juliet, but putting it in the context of America of the 1950s. Again, racial discrimination, gangs, crime, Puerto Ricans, the difficulty of cultural relations, love across the boundaries of ethnic divides. So terribly contemporary reworking of a Shakespeare idea. Bernstein, a left-wing bisexual man, using the idioms of jazz that we were talking about earlier. And two different views of America. You know, that's something I love to be in America, the Puerto Rican view, the American view. Although it's a Broadway musical, it's a very political piece, I think, but also very funny. I mean, Officer Krupke is a very funny, satirical story, essentially parodying liberals.
I mean, I think one of the great things about West Side Story, and around that period from the end of the Second World War up until probably 1979, was that one of the things that drama and film did was show us parts of society that had never been shown before. And that idea of doing a Broadway musical about gangs on the street is itself political. The idea
revolutionary idea, yeah.
The idea that these poor, underprivileged characters were worth making a play about, which in the UK was articulated through the whole angry young men thing, social realism, Alan Sillitoe, that whole 50s, 60s into the 70s idea. And I think one of the things that has happened post-79 is that those groups have sort of disappeared from our culture to a large degree. Shameless aside, you actually don't see working class characters in the way that you used to in the 60s and 70s on our screens. Do you share that perception, or?
I think that's probably right. I suppose you could say Lee Hall is a dramatist and writer who writes chiefly about working class culture, but it must be right that there is less of that than 20 or 30 years ago.
That, for me, has an impact, the idea that we're all now middle class, which is actually a very American idea, isn't it? That class doesn't exist, we're all middle class. But in fact, possibly what's happening is we're just not seeing alternatives. Somebody has pointed out in the past that in EastEnders and Coronation Street, a huge number of the characters are actually small business owners, that they're not actually working class in the traditional sense of that they're actually petty bourgeois. So aspirations are expressed through a very post-79 lens. Pre that, aspiration was much more of a political aspiration rather than an economic one.
Yes, the idea of the nobility of the working classes has largely gone now. I mean, it's a sort of romantic idea. And that has to be because the economic forces that have been unleashed, I mean, you might date it to 1979, but it seems to be, at the moment, an irresistible force with the whole trends of globalization, mean that actually those working class cultures built around industries which have been decimated have gone, and you've got a media which, by and large, speaks about the virtues, if you're not middle class, of aspiring to be middle class. And so that kind of idea of nobility in a working class has gone, and it's replaced by an idea of the working class as a kind of sort of social problem.
But a social problem that we don't try and understand through culture. We sort of culturally ignore, which I don't think can be good for our democracy, because what it results in ultimately is, for example, white working class men turning to the BNP because they feel unrepresented elsewhere. No one else is representing their cultural aspirations.
I think that's right, and you know, as a journalist, you have to move beyond easy stereotypes of, you know, for instance, the white working class BNP member, and try and understand what it is that lies behind that anger and that alienation and the inclination to blame it all on immigrants.
When we say them, these are millions and millions of people who have just disappeared from our culture.
A very profound thing you're talking about. It's almost like all the debates we were having 10, 15 years ago about representations of black nation people in the media. You know, we need to rethink those and work out our responsibilities in terms of people who are not other.
And the old Marxist response to this may have been the problem is that we've actually separated people by saying we need to support disabled people, we need to support Asian people, we need people of colour and this and that and the other. And actually that's atomised all these different groups, and that actually there were issues to do with us as a class in a capitalist society. But we won't start on that. We'll be here all day. We'll now move on to another classical piece now that you've chosen here, which is a piece of Wagner. Do you want to elaborate?
Well, you sit down and you think of politics and music, and Wagner was tremendously political in a way, and the controversial aspects of what he stood for echo right down to the present day. So, I mean, this is the Liebestod from Tristan, which you can just admire as the most voluptuous music in which can drown you and overwhelm you. And then you ask why, when Daniel Barenboim wanted to play this music in Jerusalem, did people walk out? And that takes you back to Wagner himself, you know, a Nietzschean character obsessed with the idea of Nietzschean figures and heroes, and all his music is about very political ideas of supermen and superwomen and master races and so forth. So a lot of
A
it
profoundly elitist idea
very
of human society.
troubling stuff. A lot of which we would now think of as absolutely barking mad. And so you then get this sort of interesting thing of Daniel Barenboim, in my view, a wonderful humanist, deeply interested in politics, deeply interested in the power of music to interact with politics. His East-West Divan Orchestra, the fact that he wants to play with Palestinians as well as Israelis, with Arabs as well as Jews, and has courted a lot of controversy in doing that, but sees that as the power of bringing people together. He sees the orchestra as a metaphor for how societies work, and the individuals combining together for the greater force. All that, and then as a Jew, he goes to Israel and wants to play this music, and people say this is too controversial. Wagner is too associated with the terrible things that happened in Germany in the 20th century. We can't just listen to this as music. It's the political power and ideas behind it which still make this deeply tormenting music.
And here it is. So there we are, a fantastically powerful piece of music and its effect in the modern world. Wagner was sort of picked up by Hitler and the Nazis as a representative of that Aryan culture and the idea of the superhero. So it became very closely associated with the Nazi regime, which is why it became so sensitive in Israel today.
Yeah, and Wagner was anti-Semitic. He had horrible views about Jews. So you're back into that perpetual argument about to what extent can you divorce the motivation of music, or whether artists are good or bad people from the art that they create.
Which leads us on to perhaps the biggest political issue in the world today, which is Israel-Palestine. Because Israel-Palestine, many people would argue, has informed Iraq. The whole Muslim reaction to the West, in the post-war period has been informed by Israel and the way that America particularly has supported Israel, despite what a lot of the Arab world sees as very disproportionate responses of Israel. This has been going on all through my political life. It doesn't look any closer to any resolution. So, do you hold much hope?
Not much in the short term. I think it's deeply, deeply intractable. I'm trying to think of any sort of encouraging symptom or sign at the moment. But the problem is that it's not going to be solved by the leaders of Israel and Palestine alone. It is an international problem. And you sort of wait for the alignment of like-minded people who can come together at the right moment. And it doesn't look as though we've got that at the moment.
I mean, it's been observed by some that, in fact, we're all still suffering the results of the Holocaust. Because of the context of the Holocaust, we can't really have any rational debate with Israel about the nature of what's happening there. Any criticism of Israel is seen as anti-Semitic. It's very difficult to discuss this because of the context. So we're still all now in the repercussions of those terrible events.
Yes, that has to be true. And I think any psychoanalyst will tell you that one of the consequences of perpetuating violence on people is that it perpetuates the cycle of violence. And there was a very interesting piece in the New York Review of Books, the current issue actually, about the whole American Jewish scene and the way in which that generation for whom the Holocaust was the sort of defining incident. We're now sort of 2 or 3 generations away from that, and the extent to which young Jews in America are no longer motivated by that story. They tend to be less rooted in the idea of Israel right or wrong, more open to the idea of Palestinian rights. And there's a disconnect, this article argued, between the older generation of people who tend to be the official spokespeople for American Jewish attitudes towards Israel, and the majority of young American Jews who actually feel completely differently, and saying how dangerous this could be for Israel in the years ahead. Once that generation goes, you've got people in America who are actually much more open-minded, ambivalent, and that will lead its way through from the, I was going to say knee-jerk, but almost de facto support of America for Israel through to something that would be more conditional in future.
You say that could be dangerous for Israel, but it also could be the hope for the future, which is that one could have a more rational debate about how to proceed without this constant burden.
Yes, I completely agree with that, but it requires an echo in Israel amongst the Israeli leaders who had to realize that actually they're going to have to make the argument on its merits rather than being able to just feel that they can, in the end, they've got this sort of American vote in their back pocket.
Which leads us to your next piece of music here, which is the War Requiem, again by Benjamin Britten.
Yeah, sorry about so much Benjamin Britten. Well, my most recent experience of this, I chair the National Youth Orchestra, and about 3 years ago, right at the beginning of January, so it was in the middle of the Iraq War, very heavy casualties, Iraq was falling apart. We performed the Benjamin Britten's War Requiem in St. Paul's Cathedral with 2 of the people who most associated with it. So Richard Hickox was the conductor and Philip Langridge was the main tenor soloist. Now both, alas, died since then. Cathedral absolutely packed. So there was something like 2,000 people in the cathedral that night, and young players in the orchestra between the age of 13 and 18, most of whom had never been exposed to this music. And it was incredibly powerful. It was an amazing evening because, again, of the power of the music, which was political. So there was, again, Benjamin Britten, apart from being a gay man, was also a pacifist. And this was his piece about war, written shortly after the Second World War. And he brilliantly combined the traditional Requiem liturgy, so all the Latin Dies Irae and Agnus Dei and so forth, with the poems of the First World War poets. And I just want to play the passage of Strange Meeting, which is the Wilfred Owen poem about a British and a German soldier meeting after death and having a dialogue that they couldn't have in life. And this piece was played in Coventry Cathedral after the Second World War, in the ruins of Coventry Cathedral, and it has become, I think, the most powerful piece about war and written by a pacifist. And it was just so moving that its resonance is carried through into that cathedral about a completely different war with a completely different generation. It's amazing music.
And here it is.
In thought or death to be bestowed, then as I probed them, one sprang up and stared with piteous recognition in fixed eyes, lifting distressful hands as if to bless. Thumped all down the floors, made more strange friend, I said, here is no cause to said the other, save the undone years. Whatever hope is yours, was my life also. I went hunting wild after the wildest beauty in the world. For by my gleam might many men
Something had been left, which must die now. I mean the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled. Now men will go content with what we spoil, or discontent while bloody and bespilled. They will be swift with...
So Benjamin Britten was a pacifist. I mean, this is polemical music.
Yes, though I think it's greater than that. I think that's the ability of great art to express powerful ideas in ways that rise above polemics.
Do you think someone who believed that war was a legitimate strategy would agree with that? Or they would see this as liberal polemic?
Well, I think it has to succeed as a piece of art, so I think that's probably the difference between journalism and art, that a journalist might sit down to write a polemic and an artist can transcend that and produce something that has value as a piece of art and speaks to people in a way that can persuade them.
But it persuades them of something very specific is the point I'm making about this particular thing, in that while it may work on aesthetic grounds that you'd like to apply to it, it is nonetheless polemical in the sense that it expresses quite a specific point of view, which is very much a pacifist point of view. And that isn't a universal value. From ancient philosophers onwards, there's been an attempt to justify war as a tool of human society. So it's not a universal value.
No, I suppose it was. You could have had a pro-war composer, and if any war was justified, it was the Second World War. So that was the sort of easiest war to make the case for. And you could say there were lots of militaristic music. You could say Walton's Spitfire Overture is something that is not questioning of the premises of war.
Yeah.
But I suppose the greater artistic statement is, however much individual wars are necessary, that unless you bear in mind the unbelievable human catastrophe of war, you lose all sense of what a justified war is.
Well, what interests me about that is you said the greater artistic statement is, and then made a particular statement that could be challenged politically or philosophically. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is that if you agree with the statement, which I do, by the way.
I would have thought that the statement itself is not that controversial, that generally war is something to be avoided.
Well, that's a current view, but in the 19th century, the view would have been that war is glory. And in fact, 19th century Britain was a very militaristic society where war and the military was seen as a great good. Now we have the idea that war is a regrettable necessity on occasions. That's not throughout human history been the case.
That must be, yes, I understand what you're saying, and which I suppose is why Wilfred Owen is such a significant voice in this, because up to the First World War, there was a kind of sort of easier view of war, wasn't there? Because generally it was a sort of short, sharp thing, and it wasn't causing casualties on a sort of industrial scale.
And also the casualties that were being caused were generally people who weren't valued by the elite.
Yeah, but it was also the sort of technology of war was such that wars were won with relatively few people fighting relatively quickly. It might take a day, it might take a week. I know there were campaigns went on for a very long time, but until the First World War, when the technologies of war produced a completely different kind of engagement, and just the thought of 60,000 people dying in one day,
the industrialization of
it was industrialization of killing, and over a war that most people, if you ask them on the street what was the First World War all about, who can remember what all that was about? And millions and millions of. So if you want that, the futility of war, that was the war that changed perceptions of most people forever.
Which brings us on to the wars that we've been involved in very recently. Something that I did some research into myself was the events surrounding the parliamentary vote to go into Iraq, which, MPs have said was a traumatic process for them, and that the stops were pulled out by the Labour whips in a way that perhaps has never happened before, and in a quite extraordinary way. We'd had the biggest demonstration that the UK has ever seen against the war. Parliament itself wasn't going to vote for this war without Labour doing what they did. As, editor of a national newspaper at the time, having to deal with Alistair Campbell on a daily basis, how was that experience for you? A quite extraordinary event in the undermining of our democracy.
In retrospect, it's easier than it was at the time. I mean, the Guardian was always anti-war, and we grew more sceptical the closer we got to it. But there was a problem in terms of taking a sort of absolutist position, which was if you had Blair and the intelligence services and other people I was meeting at the time who absolutely insisted on the existence of these weapons of mass destruction, and it was a difficult thing to disprove as a newspaper. So to some extent, you had to take some account of what you were being told. And I think, luckily, the British press has got a better record than the American press. So the American press, I think, for all kinds of reasons, including a sort of attachment to a notion of objectivity, which meant that they were less questioning. I think we were more questioning. The only person who really questioned the whole thing, in an effective way, was Andrew Gilligan, who then copped it. Not that he was journalistically perfect. He wasn't that. That was a flawed piece of work too. And the real failure was all the bits of the state that should have been questioning. So it was a parliamentary failure, it was a failure of cabinet, it was a failure of the intelligence services to do their job. Lots of people failed, but I think actually the press were the only people who were plugging away asking questions.
And I certainly would go along with that. Actually, I thought the press came out of that, just as a punter, a citizen, I think the press came out of that pretty well, generally speaking, across the board. But also for someone who was a sort of old Labour politically, the betrayal of any democratic principle shown by that still leave a very bitter taste with me. And what they show me is that process can be manipulated if competent men and women like Blair and Campbell decide that they're going to manipulate process. They can and do.
Yes, which I think leads us back into a view of how Parliament should run. And I think one of the worst things about the New Labour era was the extent to which Parliament failed to really get a grip on the executive. So we should look at the way the Cabinet is run, about how information is free, about the extent to which the parliamentary vote is whipped, the role of the second chamber. There were lots of bits of the state which were shown up in failing to hold the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to account.
There's a point of view which is that actually part of the problem is by having a professional parliamentary class that this is problematic, that we get into a sort of managerialist approach where people go through a system. You know how to be an MP these days. It's quite clear. Go to Oxford or Cambridge or another leading Russell Group university, you become a researcher. There is a career now. When I was at university, the worst thing you could say about somebody who was standing for office in student union politics was that they were a careerist. It was a term of great offence. But now this is all, no, you can have a career. But of course, if you've got a career, then advancement in your career becomes more important perhaps than representing your constituents. Parties become more and more powerful. And that maybe this whole thing of having career politicians is undermining the concept of democracy.
I think there's a lot in that. I think it's too big a subject to get into, and the press have got their bit to be reflective about. But you could argue that in order to step into this goldfish bowl of politics today, you'd have to be quite an odd person, really. But a lot of people look at that life and think, why would any normal person go anywhere near that? And I think that's the problem with the press and the dog in the lamppost view. If you're going to constantly attack, denigrate, and distrust anybody in political life, that's your default position, then you're probably not going to end up with very good people wanting to do those kind of jobs.
I suppose what I'm getting at is that what Michael Sandel calls a procedural republic, which is the idea that democracy is based in process. If the processes are right, then justice is achieved. And then there's another view, which has been called deliberative democracy, which actually allows for discussion and debate, and that politicians have an obligation to listen to that public discourse and to react to it. Because we have in this country this thing about the mob, this fear of the mob, where a politician will say, well, we can't respond to the public. The fact that 1 million people march against the war, we can't respond to that. We have to lead, and every 5 years you get to vote to take us out if you don't agree with us. I mean, is that sustainable as an idea of democracy?
Well, I think it is, but it also requires there to be proper debate in Parliament. And I think a lot of people would wonder whether that's now died, whether Parliament is still the cauldron of debate where ideas are thrashed around and people listen and can have their minds changed by the debate, as opposed to just being told which way to vote by the whips.
Surely that's because of the dominance of party, that actually when we elect our politicians, they don't represent us.
No,
they represent the party.
And the managerial approach to party is to make sure you deliver the vote. So, the vote is more important than the debate.
Yes.
You have an enormous number of MPs on the official payroll, so that actually the number of people who are free to vote according to conscience is less. And I think that's why some people are anxious about rushing to reform the House of Lords, which clearly needs to be reformed. There is a sense that actually it's easier to have open debates and for people to allow their minds to be changed by the debate. Because if you're not going to have your mind changed by the debate, or if you're not allowed to by the whips, then what's the point of the debate? I think people believe that at some level, and that makes them cynical about the whole political process.
Well, and I think they're right to be. There's a point of view which I would certainly think is plausible, which is that actually dissent in a democracy is absolutely crucial. And in fact, in any organisation, dissent is actually crucial to efficiency, because it's through dissent that you get alternative views. That consensus is a very dangerous and static and conservative thing, and that the press demand of our political parties, more than anything, unity. Unity is the defining feature of a successful political party, according to the press. That the moment anybody says anything which is not the party line, they are destroyed and vilified in the press. Can that be healthy?
Again, if you have a sort of mindset in which you're constantly on gaff watch, that anything that is outside a narrow range of allowable consensus views is vilified, that's problematic.
But does not the press response create that?
Yes, no, I think if you can only see politics through a veil of, quote, sensible speech and gaffes, and that anybody who speaks outside the box is vilified for doing so, then I don't think that's very grown up, and it's not going to lead to strong people speaking their minds, but that sort of comes back to who is actually going to be attracted to this career if that's how we treat them.
Yes, if we treat them as sheep. We now move on to a piece by John Adams. Now, I don't know this, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about it.
Well, if you have anxieties about modern music, as lots of people do,
modern classical
music, you might try a bit of John Adams, because he was a composer who was studying at college late 60s, early 70s, when there was a very sort of set idea of music being dissonant and atonal, and he just thought, I can't write music like this. And so he ripped it all up, and he wrote a piece called Harmonie Lyra, which began with something like 50 crashing chords, the same chords. And it was just his way of saying, I cannot write this kind of music. And so he writes very tonal music. It began as straight minimalism, so it was repeated patterns, but it's become more sophisticated than that. And I think lots of people listen to this and they think, I didn't realize modern classical music could be this unthreatening to listen to. So that's his music. And he's also become very interested in political themes. So he wrote an opera called The Death of Klinghoffer, talking about Israel-Palestine, which was the man of the Achille Lauro, which was hijacked by terrorists, and this guy, Klinghoffer, who was in a wheelchair, was assassinated by the terrorists. That begins with two great choruses, one of the Jews, one of the Arabs. And again, it's classical music coming to terms with political themes. And he's written another opera recently called Dr. Atomic, which was about the invention of the atom bomb. But this Nixon in China, which we're about to hear, was his first attempt at doing these political themes. And it was about the visit of Nixon to China. And when it's staged, there's this fast aeroplane landing on stage. Nixon comes down, and out of this, there's a set of dances called it's an opera. So it's a full-scale opera,
lyrics.
Taking a modern political event, a right-wing Republican president being the person who made the breakthrough with communist China. This feeling that maybe it takes a Netanyahu in order to do the deal with the Palestinians. And out of this came the Nixon dances from Nixon in China, incredibly accessible music around this incredibly original idea of writing a big-scale political opera about current themes rather than writing it about ancient Greece or ancient Rome.
And here it is.
My name's Chris Jury, and you're listening to Agitpop on North Cotswold Community Radio. And that was the Nixon Dances from Nixon in China by John Adams, chosen by my guest this evening, Alan Rusbridger, editor of The Guardian newspaper. Well, that was a fascinating piece, Alan, but how do you respond to people who would challenge the validity of a political opera? Because opera is such a rarefied and minority art form.
Is it? I mean, I think something like Carmen or Tosca can have highly popular, very tuneful operas which lots of people love. Although I appreciate the thing behind it, that going to the operas in this country tends to be rather an elitist form.
And simultaneously subsidised.
Yeah. Go to Germany and there are 40 or 50 operas, every small town it's subsidised, but they feel it's almost a sort of, you can't be a proper town in Germany unless you've got your own opera house and
theatre.
And theatre. So it's not seen as a minority or elitist taste there. So I suppose you could say that if you're going to try and change people's attitudes about opera, rather than just doing the 18th and 19th century masterpieces, and rather than sitting down today to take an ancient theme, as some composers do. I mean, Harrison Birtwistle wrote an opera about Gawain and the Green Knight, and sort of taking in ancient mythologies in the way that Wagner did. Isn't it a way of people seeing that modern classical music can tackle big contemporary themes of amazing relevance, and that music isn't this sort of irrelevant thing that existed in the past? It's up to the task of engaging with modern day politics and
it's to be vibrant and alive. It absolutely has to do that.
I think so, yeah.
And certainly, if public money is going to be used to subsidise it, one would think all the art need to.
Well, define ways of engaging. I mean, it doesn't have to be head on through politics, but I guess you want to find themes that are powerful and seem relevant, especially to younger audiences.
Which leads us to another classical piece. This is this is fantastic for the show, actually. This idea of classical music engaging politically is not an idea that's been expressed on the show before, and I think it's fantastic that it has been, and it's very illuminating to people, I think. And we move on to Shostakovich.
Shostakovich 5. Just in parentheses here, if any listeners like this idea of politics and music, there's a really great book came out a couple of years ago, which was a history of the 20th century through music by a guy called Alex Ross, and it's called The Rest is Noise. It really opens your mind to the way that you can tell the history of a century through music, or the way that composers engage with it. Because sometimes I think, particularly with classical music, you listen to it and you think, I can't get an entry point into that. I don't know what it's about. What am I supposed to be thinking when I listen to it? And when you learn the stories behind these pieces, you realize that all music is political, really. So this piece, Shostakovich 5, was Shostakovich writing under Stalin, a very frightened man, in a way. I think all Soviet artists were frightened about...
Quite rationally
about the limits of what they could write. And it was in response. It came just after he'd written an opera on the theme of Macbeth, and had been absolutely hammered by Pravda and the arbiters of Soviet taste in a way that must have been deeply menacing as a composer. And then he writes this piece in a different style. It's been written up as a Soviet artist's response to justified criticism. Now, there have been many, many books written on what exactly was the meaning of that. Was this a symphony of Shostakovich essentially buckling his knee to the Soviet regime, justified criticism,
an act of submission,
writing more acceptable music, or is it satirical? We're going to play the fourth movement, which is extremely violent, turbulent music. Is there sort of a satire underneath this, which the Soviet censors didn't appreciate? So you look at the whole of Shostakovich's output, and there is still, I think forever will be, a debate about the extent to which he was a free artist, or the extent to which he felt impelled to write in a style that was acceptable to the people who would have had no compunction about killing him if they felt threatened by him. So again, it's about the power of music to be incredibly threatening to political regimes. Music which you might go to the concert hall and just listen to as a series of sounds, or you can think about the unbelievable political forces that shape this music.
And here it is. fantastically powerful piece of music there, and you can all be thinking about what ideas that conveyed to you, if any. Something you said before the song there about this disengagement in the modern era between culture and ideas. There's a line of thought that puts a lot of blame on that to the romantic notions of art, which came about in the early parts of the 19th century, which were most extremely expressed in aestheticism, which said art for art's sake, that art should not have use. It should be useless, and that it's a good thing if art is useless. Where do you stand on that, the idea that actually those romantic notions of art have undermined it in the views of a wide audience, because they have literally made it useless?
Oh, I think I'm a bit of an art for art's sake person. I think this thing that we're talking about today of finding politics in music, which I think was sometimes explicitly there and sometimes not, but to dismiss art that doesn't have a kind of utilitarian or a political drive behind it as being of lesser value, I struggle with that.
But that wouldn't be the argument. The argument would merely be that by its nature, art conveys meaning, because human beings search for meaning. So even in abstract art, what actually most people do is look at it and search for meaning. So actually that meaning is a part of coherent, and that without meaning, it is literally meaningless.
I don't think that's the only way that people respond to art, and I can think of great art which sort of bucks that. I think you listen to some of the French 20th century music, which completely rebels against this sort of Germanic tradition and Germanic forms, and which was very influenced by Far Eastern music, Polynesian music, Balinese music, and is much more about almost a random association of sounds, sort of like messiaen.
But you're describing meaning to me.
Well, am I?
The point I'm trying to get to is that from a philosophical point of view, arts for art's sake as an idea is sort of logically incoherent, because you're using art to justify the justification for the art. And that actually it's a misrepresentation of what people mean. What people mean is they're nervous about assigning utility to art, because that might mean somebody then has to decide what that utility is. So you end up with a sort of Stalinist social realism. That's not the necessary consequence of acknowledging that art of art's role is to convey meaning. You know, as you described, a description of the 20th century through music doesn't sound extraordinary to me, because I think that's what culture does. I think that's what art does. It expresses
yes, I suppose I'm trying to think of art that is sort of outside the theme of what we're talking about today. Which I'm just using the example of sort of Balinese music. I mean, you could say, well, that comes from a completely different political tradition, which is not about the individual.
And it wouldn't be meaningless to the Balinese.
It wouldn't be Balinese to them. It would be Balinese, wouldn't be meaningless.
To them.
But it is, yes, it's about a different kind of idea of society, and that is about sounds that aren't driven by the individual composer shaping it, but they're sort of almost more like naturally occurring sounds.
I would be someone who would question the value in that, but we won't go there because we'll be here all afternoon, as you say. We're dealing with big themes here, which is what this show's all about. So we're moving on now. We're coming close to the end. We've only got a couple more tracks left now, and we're going more to the popular end now. This is a track I particularly love from a movie that I think is an amazing piece of work. My mother had this album. The film we're talking about is Cabaret, which came out in 1972. And my mother had this album. This wasn't a music that I was listening to in 1970. I don't know how I came across it, but I put it on and I became absolutely enthralled by this. It's an amazing piece of work. And this is the song, If You Could See Her Through My Eyes, which is sang by Joel Grey as the host of the club. And here it is, If You Could See Her Through My Eyes.
I know what you're thinking. You wonder why I chose her. Out of all the ladies in the world, it's just a first impression. What good's a first impression? If you knew her like I do, it would change your point of view. If you could see her through my eyes, you wouldn't wonder at all. If you could see her through my eyes, I guarantee you would fall like I did when we're in public together. I hear society moan, but if they could see us through my eyes, maybe they'd leave us alone. How can I speak of her virtues? I don't know where to begin. She's clever, she's smart, she reads music. She doesn't smoke or drink gin like I do. Yet when we're walking together, they sneer if I'm holding her hand. But if they could see her through my eyes, maybe they'd all understand. Why don't they leave us alone? Meine Damen und Herren, Mesdames et Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, is it a crime to fall in love? Can one ever choose where the heart leads us? All we ask is ein bisschen Verständnis, a little understanding. Why can't the world leben und leben lassen? Live und let live. Oh, I understand your objection. I grant you the problem's not small. But if you could see her through my eyes, she wouldn't look Jewish at all.
So the whole of Cabaret, the film, was designed around that type of sort of social political cabaret between the wars in Germany.
Yes, I mean, I thought of choosing some Kurt Weill, and it's all that era we think of as Brecht Weill. So the film Cabaret is around the decadent nightclub scene in the 1930s, just as the menace of fascism was manifesting itself. It's a musical, so again, it's like some of the things we talked about earlier of adopting musical forms that don't seem related to politics. And it's a love story, Liza Minnelli. A lot of the songs are tuneful, delightful, but there is this underlying menace, which I think was brilliantly captured in that film of decadence, of the menace and the Nazis in the club. And this song, If You Could See Her Through My Eyes, you really don't get to the punchline until the very last lines.
I think he's the powerhouse of the film, rather than Minnelli, actually.
Yeah.
I think he's truly extraordinary.
Yeah.
But I also think the most powerful moment in the film for me is when they're outside and the young Nazis start singing the Linden Tree.
Yeah.
The reason why I think that's so powerful, because it shows you how it could have happened. You know, how that could have swept a nation, and that actually Wagner and culture and Edelweiss and the Linden Tree and that whole thing was a crucial part of how Hitler created this version of Germany. I mean, it was a cultural creation as much as it was a political one, which is what enabled people to be taken along.
It's a masterpiece of a film, I think.
Truly extraordinary. And another fantastically polemical film, going back to our anti-war theme and the First World War, is Oh, What a Lovely War. We had, a couple of weeks on, we had Dudley Sutton, the actor who had worked with Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop, not at this time, a little bit after Oh, What a Lovely War. And Oh, What a Lovely War was created by the Theatre Workshop, Joan Littlewood, as an openly polemical piece, but bringing in all different forms of, the war poets and the fairground entertainers. An extraordinary diversity of stuff she brought into this. And then of all the people in the world to get to make the film was Richard Attenborough. It was quite extraordinary that he should get to do it, because he was an actor then. This was his first film, and it is a tour de force. I, however, think it does take the teeth out of it.
I think that's probably right. I did it at school, and I did it again at university, but playing in the band this time. So I think the theatrical production has an edge which maybe was softened by the film. But, I mean, it was a brilliant conception. Probably something which, if it had started as a film, would never have had the power. As you say, it was being produced by Joan Littlewood and a workshop, and this idea of taking the songs from the First World War and subverting them, or using them in a different context, a bit like earlier the Wilfred Owen and the Britain, and the immense power of the popular songs, the songs that the troops sang, and the awful pathos of these songs that were sung in order to keep your spirits up as you were going, most of them, to certain death for a war which was ultimately futile.
And around that time, there were a number of films about the 19th century militarism. You know, there was Zulu was made around that time. There was The Charge of the Light Brigade that was made around that time, that were re-examining that notion of 19th century imperialism and militarism specifically in British society. And the First World War was the last hurrah of that, where the troops were seen as just ways of articulating the interests of the ruling elite. Which brings me back to this notion of the mob and the way the ruling elite are happy to use the mob as cannon fodder, but also being afraid of the mob in terms of the fact that the mob might assert themselves in ways that they, as an elite, don't like.
Yeah, and I suppose you could tie the media into this as well. You know, there's lots of arguments about whether the First World War would have lasted a week if you'd had the modern media, if people had been able to see and hadn't been sheltered from what was going on, whether there could have been possibly any massive political support for what was going on. Same argument in Vietnam. It was arguably the media coverage nightly on the TV set. And I think that there's a trend going on now which is to make wars unreportable. So I think a lot of smart militaristic regimes have learnt to keep reporters out of war zones in order to make wars very difficult to report, because they know that they would never have legitimacy or support if you could actually see what war involved.
I mean, how do you feel about embedding?
Well, not great, but if it's the only way to...
So they've made it, Ian.
Well, they've made it the way, but I mean, the nature of modern warfare is that it is much more difficult to report. You know, there often isn't a front. So, you know, sending somebody to the assault in places like Afghanistan or Baghdad, you know, the nature of modern warfare now makes it almost impossible to go and send a witness, because it's not like there's a deep trench and there's a fight going on there. It's much more random than that.
But Vietnam was random like that, and yet people did just go to Saigon and hang out and wait to hear stuff was happening.
No, but they could stay in the hotels at night, and they could go out to the front during the day and then be back at the hotels at night. And that, you know, right up to 15 years ago was the shape of warfare. But nowadays it's much more, you know, an IED on a road in Helmand is a very difficult thing for any reporter to cover. Well, it's impossible to cover except as an embed. And that sort of window that opened up between the First World War and today, in which you thought that the media would be a force that would help prevent war, I think that's changing again.
And of course the difficulty is that as politicians and now the military, as you say, and corporations indeed, respond to the press and try to manage that response of the press, it becomes much more difficult for the press to respond in an independent way.
Yeah, well...
I mean, if the Guardian sent someone in embedded and then sent a report back that the army didn't like, would the army disembed you?
Well, that's never happened, and the reporters we've had who have been embedded have come back with very uncomfortable stuff. There was an incident a couple of years ago where ITN, I think, were banned from going on embeds because it was felt that they weren't producing the right kind of reports. And I think, you know, it's the duty of media organisations to be absolutely firm in resisting that.
Well, and I hope we could all give a big hurrah to that. But I'm afraid that's brought us to the end of our time on Agitpop tonight. Not just for tonight, but for the whole of Series 1. So thank you very much, Alan, for your time this evening, and I hope all of you out there have enjoyed these conversations as much as I have. It's been a great run, and I've really enjoyed these conversations. So tonight we're going to play out with Alan's last suggestion, which is "Oh What a Lovely War," from the Attenborough film of Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop production of the same name. So please join us next year on the next series of Agitpop. It's been a pleasure.
rising slush, and using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Who wouldn't join the army? That's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilian sitting beside the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Who wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as your caddy is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up till the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got bun and apple jam? Form 4's right turn. How should we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Ladies and gentlemen, when the Conscription Act was passed, 51,000 able-bodied men left home without leaving any forwarding address.
Shame!
And that's in West Ham alone.
Women of England, do your duty. Send your men to enlist today.
Have you an able-bodied groom, chauffeur, or gamekeeper serving you?
If so, shouldn't they be serving their country?
Is your best boy in khaki? If not, shouldn't he be?
What did you do in the last war, Daddy?
Oh, 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 it's a lovely, oh, 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 it's a lovely, oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Beg pardon, sir. How do you think the war's going?
Oh, not too badly. Everything's under control.
Think we'll have peace by Christmas, sir?
Well, there's no telling, is there?
Could go on for 30 years.
You must understand, my man. War is a political and economic necessity.
Mrs. gave 6 sons, sir.
Oh, really? Oh, well, keeps them off the streets.
If you want to give us any feedback, please email us at studio@northcotswoldonline.com, or you can give us a call at 0844 8808 265.